All right, just when you thought it was over, chapter 10, part 2. Fooled you, didn't I? All right, so part 2, we're going to talk about economic sanctions. There was just too much in chapter 10 to put in one video, so I wanted to separate the two, give you a focus on economic sanctions. One of the big things we focus on in economic sanctions is restitution. So restitution is a court-ordered payment by the offender to the victim or the victim's family to cover tangible losses that occurred during the following crime. The losses for compensation can include a multitude of different things like medical expenses, lost income due to a direct result of the crime, transportation to and from court, child care, counseling services, sexual assault exams, HIV testing, moving expenses, travel and meal expenses, and burial expenses. The eligible parties include the victims' families, and organizations that provide care, shelter, or counseling. And the way this works is the victim actually has to apply for restitution through the prosecutor's office. They have to press charges and they have to agree to testify. So to recap, 3 things in order for victims to receive benefits of victim compensation programs. First, they have to apply for the program, they have to press charges, and they have to agree to participate. And in every jurisdiction, they have a little bit of different procedures and policies in place. Usually, the person has to have agreed to press charges within like 72 hours of the crime. But that's just the general idea. So when we talk about restitution, there are a few problems associated with restitution. And let me give you a practical example that I went through as a probation officer. So I told you in a previous video about when I was doing my first pre-sentence report with the Gibson family. Well, that was actually my first supervision case as well. So what happened was these people got in trouble for stealing Social Security checks. At the time, Social Security checks were delivered via mail. So they would go around stealing checks from mailboxes and go to like grocery stores, big chain grocery stores, to cash them. So they would cash these checks, and a lot of times people say, well, what'd they use the money for? Well, oddly enough, they used the money because Rose Gibson wanted to play bingo. So she had a bad bingo addiction. So she stole Social Security checks to play bingo. And what I always like to say is bingo, the gateway drug to gambling addiction. But that's just a sidebar note there. So, all right, so as a result of stealing this money, we have a victim. Number one, it's the government because they stole it from the government. Number two, these people couldn't get their Social Security checks, so they had a financial burden. But the court only ordered restitution to the government. So me as probation officer, I was required to go and get money from them. Well, here's a problem, like I was saying. It's difficult to get money from people who have no money. And I think I told you before that when I would do the home visit, they literally had a dirt floor. You walk in their house and they had a dirt floor. The floor was so old, it was that hard packed dirt, you know, that was like really, really shiny and really hard. So here's my dilemma. Why would I want to get money from somebody that's too poor to even have a regular floor, number one, which I didn't. I ended up giving them a referral to some housing assistance to get something going on there. And number two, these people were really unemployable. I mean, they did not have a high school diploma, and they all had some mental issues. So those are some big problems with restitution. It's one thing to get a restitution order, but it's certainly another thing to get that restitution money. Another problem is, so we got the problem, first of all, of indigent defendants, and that's indigence means people who can't afford to pay. And number two, the problem of collecting restitution. Number three, even before those two, is the problem of determining the proper amount of restitution. How do we figure out how much to owe? Here's an example. Let's say, well, I'll give you one of my cases. I had an offender who went through a mall, and shot out a door of a mall. So who gets the money for that? The mall? No, the mall is covered by insurance, but the mall had a deductible. So what I did was ordered the amount of the deductible to be paid to the mall, and then ordered the balance of whatever the insurance paid to be paid directly to the insurance company. So, as I said before, indigent offenders are people who cannot pay. And it's one thing if they can't pay, but it's another thing if they have the money to pay and just refuse to pay. I had another case where I knew a guy had money to pay. He was just refusing to pay. And I mean, really, I can't fault him for that, but it was a fine instead of restitution. So what I had to do was I had to do an intensive financial investigation on this guy and go back and check for hidden assets and get income tax returns and check with his business profits, and it was very difficult. Come to find out, the judge determined that he did have the ability to pay and modified his probation accordingly. So you can't put somebody in prison just because they can't afford to pay. But if they can pay, there are some options that you can do. Now, declaring bankruptcy, that is no way to get out of paying your restitution. That does not excuse the offender from paying restitution. When we look at some other things we have to look at is the offender's ability to pay when we're looking at restitution. Here's some criteria that you want to examine. What are the offender's financial obligations, and what is the offender's ability to pay? I mean, you have to ask them, how many bills do you have? What do you use all your money for? Then you have to determine whether the victim was insured or was partially at fault. You also have to look at the expenses the victim incurred because of the crime. The prosecutor has to establish the amount of harm beyond a preponderance of the evidence. And the harm and cost that qualify for the restitution also have to be looked at, as well as the plea agreement. So in collecting restitution, how do we go about doing that? I mean, you all probably have credit. You don't really go out and buy a car and pay cash for it, do you? You usually pay installments like most people do. And that's really how we look at restitution. If you can't afford to pay it all, we're going to work with them and have them pay installments. So, yeah, I mean, we wear many hats in community corrections, and we're kind of like quasi bill collectors if you think of it that way, but with a twist. So probation officers are responsible for collecting restitution. Day reporting centers do it. Restitution centers do it, and so on. Now, if you have like a misdemeanor case, an alternative to restitution, if they can't afford it, may be community service. Community service is just providing work for free. And you can kind of calculate how much community service you as the community corrections officer want to order by looking at minimum wage. Let's say a person did $400 worth of harm and you're looking at $8 in minimum wage payments, so you just divide 8 into 400, and that's how much you would probably request. But that's just one way of looking at it. Use your own judgment. So what kind of community service? Here's the problem with community service, though. A lot of times, believe it or not, organizations don't want convicted offenders up there helping them. But if you're willing to go supervise them, you might be able to work something out. Here are some common things that they do on community service, like picking up trash, washing police cars, doing landscaping, removing litter, graffiti, maybe painting public buildings, and so on. Okay, so aside from restitution, another economic sanction is a fine. So restitution payments go directly to the victim. Fines, on the other hand, go to the government. And a fine is a monetary sanction imposed by the judge, and the amount depends on the severity of the offense. Usually you have to look to the statute to determine the exact fine range that a court can order. There are two types of fines. There are fixed fines and there are day fines. So 90% of the fines usually go to victim witness assistance programs, or victim compensation programs, which is pretty good. We got to fund them some way. And a fine is viewed as a punishment and can be imposed as a penalty or in combination with a penalty. So a judge would probably order a fine just for a minor misdemeanor, but in felony cases, the courts tend to order fines in conjunction with another harsher type of sentence. Another type of obligation are fees, and a fee is a court-imposed reimbursement that the offender pays for the administration of the criminal justice system. So this is like court costs, in other words. And typical fees can also go for the following, like DNA and drug testing, alcohol testing, diagnostic testing, inpatient, outpatient treatment, prosecution, court costs, repayment of fees for appointed counsel, and that's very rare, community supervision fees, or electronic monitoring or GPS fees. Those are some different types of fees. Another sanction is forfeiture. Forfeiture is kind of weird because the government can take all your stuff just because they think you did a crime. And this became real popular because of drugs. Let's say, for example, you're traveling in a known drug route, maybe it's from Florida up to Baltimore. You know, there are highways that law enforcement have dubbed congested with drug trafficking. So let's say they pull you over and in a bag they find $20,000 in $50 bills and $20 bills. Chances are you're going to forfeit that. So they'll take your stuff and you have to petition the court to get it back. Let's say they suspect you of buying a motorcycle with drug proceeds, so they can forfeit that property as well. And that's really all I have to say about economic sanctions. So thanks for listening. Stay tuned for Chapter 11.